See that? Getting better at this. All right, so we'll move to the next question regarding prompt 1 for the evaluation criteria. How would evaluating the effectiveness of the current rate-making procedures to promote advanced technologies and alternative resources address the policy objectives? So we did see comments from stakeholders in the written comments asking to evaluate the promotion of advanced technologies and alternative resources, but we wanted to make sure that if we do consider these, how would they address the policy objectives that we outlined previously? Jennifer?
Well, I think we've been supportive of the integrated resource planning process to evaluate alternative resources and the role that energy efficiency and demand response play in electric resource planning. We believe it would address the policy objectives by identifying a resource plan that is objectively reasonable in relation to other plans. So I feel bad leaving the gas and water out of this. But I think in general, you know, comparing your options, you know, to technological developments and rate plans. I mean, the goal is to come up with an efficient outcome in general.
Yes.
Looking here for the large energy group. We'd agree a lot with what Jennifer just said, that especially as far as resource planning, as a customer group, it is very hard to evaluate a lot of these policy objectives when there is no requirement for resource planning in Iowa currently, or the ability to for customers to get access to that kind of information. So I think one of the things, especially when we're talking about also, you know, alternative resources and advanced technologies, to make sure it's part of an overall plan, and to make sure we're not incentivizing or providing bonus rates for things that are no longer advanced, but are now standard and mature technologies.
Lori on Zoom.
Hi, yes, I wanted to weigh in to echo what Jennifer said. There's no current process in Iowa that looks at total system costs and when evaluating new resource addition options and compares potential total plan costs of, you know, the existing resource mix to other resource alternatives to ensure we're getting the lowest cost resource mix. And an IRP or integrated resource planning process can do that. It can also help identify the lowest risk. We haven't talked about risk, but allow for evaluation of certain resources mixes under varying scenarios about what the future might look like, and, you know, low or high gas prices and that kind of thing. And it can also allow us to address reliability and resource adequacy, where we don't really have any procedures that I know of in which we can assess the reliability of a utility's resource mix or a proposed resource addition. So I think all of those policy objectives would be advanced with integrated resource planning.
Bob?
Yeah, Bob Rafferty. I think this is really a critical issue when we're looking at the electric grid of the future. The challenge we have is our current rate making processes build in a disincentive for electric utilities to invest in trying to implement third-party resources. whether that's third-party generation or perhaps it's more active demand management and demand response. By leveraging those third-party resources, it obviously reduces the amount of capital investment necessary for the electric grids moving forward. So by investing in those third-party assets, they're basically reducing their future potential profit. So I think by addressing that through the rate making change, we can start aligning the goals and objectives and interests of the ratepayer more closely with the utilities, so that we don't just need a regulatory process to get to the most efficient system, but we could also have both the utilities financial interests and the ratepayers' interests more closely aligned than it is today for the electric utilities. Thank you.
Joanne on Zoom.
Yeah, I just wanted to flag that, I definitely agree with the comments about integrated resource planning. I worked for AP for 15 years before I worked for Voltus, and I think it's a practice in a lot of jurisdictions that gives stakeholders some participation in those issues. But I also wanted to just flag that on our written comments, we talked about services and technologies available from demand response aggregators that could be of benefit to Iowa ratepayers. And I just wanted to flag that as perhaps being responsive to the question, but I won't be redundant to my written comments.
Noted, thank you. Dustin?
Yeah, I was going to address specifically the technologies and the policy objectives. And I think, what you saw in a lot of written comments is certainly the advanced rate making process has been extremely successful in what it did in 2001, setting that 300 megawatt threshold. We were able to attract capital and build generation. And then in 2003, when we put renewables, clearly that's now that we see that a proliferation, especially of wind in the state. I think, with the comments, there's going to be not necessarily even just this session, a pretty healthy discussion about what's the next level potentially for policymakers, because I think as we talk about the grid of the future, one of the things that has to be addressed is the reliability and the intermittent side of things. So what's going to fill that gap? I know some folks, talking about storage, talking about potential gas peakers, talking about potential for nuclear. I think we want to have that conversation, but ultimately, what is the policy objective of where we want to get to as a state, rather than anything, what we view as above a base rate amount. That policy objective has worked for renewables. So what the next grid of the future looks like, would we apply those same standards towards potentially something beneath that 300 megawatt or putting something in that bucket related to renewables?
Yes.
Yeah, Samantha Norris for the Iowa Economic Alliance. I would echo a lot of the comments allowing integrated resource planning. I think it gets at a lot of the definitions that we just went through and the policy objectives of ensuring safe, adequate, reliable, and affordable utility services. I think it's hard to determine if you've got that without taking a holistic look at the utilities resource plan. And I think that a good integrated resource planning process can and should include a lot of the evolving and emerging technologies that will help address grid issues, make the grid more efficient, make the utility stack more efficient. So we would echo that. I don't know that changes to the advanced rate making process could be made to account for maybe smaller generation resources, like Mr. Miller said, or different technologies. But I think, the concerns that some of the groups and interested folks today have with advanced rate making isn't with what you can get advanced rate making for. It's how that advanced rate making process has kind of played itself out over the years in contested cases.
Just as a note that we plan to discuss both IRP and long-term planning as well as advanced rate making further on in the discussions. Just as a note there, Joanne, do you have another point? Or just the hand still raised? Okay. Yes.
Just from Adam Berman, Black Hills Energy, from a natural gas perspective, we do find value to the promotion of advanced technologies, especially when it comes to PHMSA regulations and ongoing government mandates. We have a data infrastructure improvement plan which implements advanced technologies into safety objectives, reliability objectives, and so just note from a natural gas perspective, we do see the value of promoting advanced technologies and meeting those policy objectives.
Yes.
I just wanted to add that I think one of the limitations of the current processes and procedures is that because we, again, integrated resource planning, because we do not have that in place, it's basically up to the utilities to decide what kinds of advanced technologies and alternative resources they want to bring to the table. And there's a limited or really no ability for other stakeholders to say, you should look at this instead, or to really push back against that with an alternative. And so, whereas the interests of the utility, aren't always aligned with what customers or other groups are after, that creates a real imbalance. And so there is a need for a venue to be more on equal footing for some of those conversations. And I think an integrated resource plan is one place to do that.
Margie McWilliams, American Water. I also wanted to kind of add to what Adam says. We have the same, we're in the same playing field here, because with water, there's always changing compliances. We're always after advanced technologies to continue to be in compliance and provide safe, reliable water. We also have, EPA regulations that are always changing, more stringent all the time, as well as Iowa Department of Natural Resources compliances. We have to be in alignment with as well. So that's something of a concern for us, that we want to be able to stay ahead of the curve and not wait until something terrible happens.
Yeah, Jeff Ripp with Alliant. We're going to talk more about resource planning, and I just want to be clear. Utilities do have robust planning processes to make decisions on resource additions and subtractions to certain customers. What's critical is these are investments in long-lived assets, and we need processes that provide that certainty as we make those investments, that we will continue to get recovery of that investment from customers. So when you think about, if we think about the effectiveness of current rate making procedures, that's the goal. If I don't know that a process would end up with everybody agreeing, because I think there's a diversity of opinions even in this room on what those resources might be, but think about that process and to drive the objectives we talked about before: reliability, safety, affordability, increasingly sustainability for customers. The process, the regulatory process itself, has to result in that certainty.
Yes. Logan Ashenfelter, IPL. Just something to consider as we are discussing advanced technologies and alternative resources with rate making processes. Is maybe nuclear is the best example, with a construction timeframe that can take 10 years or more. That the current rate making process in Iowa only allows for rate recovery after that project is put in service, and that perhaps to balance the risk to the utility, maybe some rate recovery of the financing costs during that long duration construction period would minimize long-term costs for customers and risk to utility and investors.
Okay, great, thank you. Finally, for this point, Are there any other terms or criteria that you believe are important to consider relative to evaluating the current legislation for the policy objectives? So outside of what we discussed earlier and defined earlier, is there any other terms or criteria that we should be looking to evaluate? All right, we will move on to prompt number 2, looking more specific at the Iowa rate making procedures. So the current authority and responsibilities of the board are a critical element of the rate making process. So we would like to get stakeholder feedback on whether and how those responsibilities and authority of the board should change. So should the board's authorities and responsibilities be expanded? For example, should they be given the authority to initiate rate cases after a determined period of time, and why? Should the board have the authority to open an inquiry into utility rates at its own discretion? And what other authorities and responsibilities should be bestowed to the board? So
So I think in response to the questions you have up there, I think the statute allows the board to begin an inquiry into utility rates. I think the big drawback is, how is that, procedurally, how is that going to happen, and who's going to provide the information that's necessary for the board to make a decision? Because in the normal rate making process, the utility has all the information and files that information in support of the rates that they propose. If you, like OCA or the board can initiate a proceeding, the problem is what information are they going to be able to provide? I think it's also, even IBEC, the industrials have run into the same problem. They have some real questions about the rate design currently for Mid-American, but one of the problems is, the cost and what information can they provide for the board to support their position with regard to the current rate design. But I think the board has the authority now. The question is it reasonable? Is it a reasonable option for the board? And that I don't know. But I think as far as the board's responsibilities, I think they have sufficient authority to address almost all issues that have come before them. I think if you go back and look, the basic construct is that the board sets rates based upon the costs and revenues that are presented to them. And they also make decisions with regard to issues in those dockets. Over the years, the rate making process, the rate regulation process has provided the board, I think, sufficient flexibility to address almost all issues. And I think certain parties have not agreed with the board's decision on those issues, and the board, may have made decisions which don't play out the way the board thought. But I think the board has the authority, and I think excellent examples of that is when the legislature considered going to deregulate electric utility service in Iowa, they chose not to. So then what happened is Mid-American came back to the board and said, well, here, if you're not going to deregulate, here is an alternative way to regulate rates in Iowa. And the board approved their revenue sharing mechanism. But whether you agree with that revenue sharing mechanism and whether you agree whether the board should have done it, it has provided Mid-American ability to stabilize rates over the years. And they've only had, I think has been pointed out, they've only had one rate case since the revenue sharing was implemented. So then the question is, when we talk about before comparison, why haven't the other utilities done that? Well, that's an individual utility decision, but I think that shows you the flexibility that the board has. In addition, there have been issues raised not only in the natural gas industry, but in the water industry about, we are required by federal regulations, by environmental laws to replace our facilities, to upgrade our facilities for safety. the board has put into place trackers that have allowed them to pass along those costs to ratepayers. So there is flexibility under the current system. And I think if you think that the board needs more authority, I think you have to be specific about what the board is not able to address under the current law that they're able to do now. They may choose not to go to make that decision, but I think they have the authority pretty much under the flexibility of the current system, under the regulation mechanism to address almost all issues. And I think probably that will play out into the future. I think the decision now, and I agree with the legislature, it's probably time to look at this again. You know, should we change that rate regulation system? That's the underlying question here. Should we go away from that to some other system of regulated rates?
Lori in Zoom.
Sorry, I feel like I'm speaking too much. I think various folks have mentioned the value of integrated resource planning, and the value that regularly occurring IRPs would have to the public, stakeholders, and to the board, give people transparency into what's coming next, and help level set. Even if everybody doesn't agree, at least people will understand what's coming. I think there are lots of great arguments as to why the board does have the authority to already require utilities to do that kind of transparent planning. But additional, clear, more explicit statutory or regulatory authority would certainly make the process a lot easier. The board had initiated a few years ago a generation planning docket that was intended to basically create or provide information to the public, or to even just to the board, on what the utilities' expectations were about the future, what their load growth was, what resources they were expecting to use. And the process cannot be called a success. There was a lot of stalling, and eventually the docket was closed, and I don't think the board was ever given the information they asked for. So I would not call the existing processes adequate. And I think IRPs could really help at least provide some transparency about what we can all expect the future to look like.
Yes, Samantha.
Yeah, from our perspective, I think, we'd agree with Mr. Wright that, the board can initiate certain investigations, certain inquiries, rate cases. I think what is lacking is some clarity around the process, where the evidence comes from, what they can rely on, and even some more set criteria, right? Is it a material, have things changed over a certain amount of time, whether it's load growth or portfolio changes or I don't know, any sort of things, right? But either there's a trigger or there's some more guidance to the board as to what could trigger an investigation or a rate case, and then what the processes would be, so that either they start an inquiry, for example, first, and then they get more information, and then they decide whether to initiate one. That is very open. And I think when Cecil was talking about, I think what the case that I read, and I believe the tech customers maybe were involved in that too, on cost allocation, there was questions of evidence and process and how that would work. So I think that could be clarified. Other things that I think, Lori touched on this a little bit, as have others, but integrated resource planning can touch on all of these things. But right now the board's powers, they can address pieces of it in one statute, pieces of it in another, pieces of it in a third, pieces of it in a fourth, and the board doesn't necessarily have that one statute that says they can do a holistic approach or a holistic overview. And I'm talking more specifically about the electric investor owned, so not to confuse the water and gas piece. And then the other thing that I would bring up